So tonight we're going to talk about the historical role of Freemasonry. The subject was suggested to me by a tipper, whose name I believe is Monsieur Fabrice's goat, isn't it, Leo? Yes, that's right. Who asked a question about it? And so I was pretty sure it was going to come up on the next live, since when you ask questions on Type E, they come up on the first live that comes along. And so I knew I was going to have to answer this question anyway. But since it's a subject I've dealt with in the story of the coming century, I knew I'd have to answer it anyway. But as it's a subject I've dealt with in the history of the next century, I knew I'd have a lot to answer. And so I thought it would be a long answer to a question that might unbalance the live show. Live on it, since, or logically, the tipper in question must be here. So welcome Monsieur Fabrice's goat to this live chat. If he's live in the chat room, in which case he shouldn't hesitate to stand up and be recognized. It's an interesting subject because people regularly ask me questions about it, because Freemasonry is a divisive subject which has a certain importance for a certain number of people, because it's an organization which still exists, which still has a certain influence, perhaps as much or even more so in private than in public affairs, since it can explain relationships between people, it can explain problems in legal proceedings. It can happen, so today's affair is Freemasonry has this problem. It still appears to be an alternative network, but one always suspects that its rules take precedence for those who belong to it over the rules of society, i.e., for example, people will pass on, I don't know, their loyalty to Freemasonry before their professional ethics, that sort of thing. So that's why there's a lot of fantasies or less fantasized things that can also take place with it. And so it fascinates a little, and then it fascinates too. Why? Quite simply because it's a secret society, and it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing to look at the effect of these secret societies, Can they have one? So that's the question we're going to try and answer this evening. Jonathan already said on Twitter, I don't remember what he said to me this evening. No, Freemasonry doesn't have a decisive role to play, since he's only interested in, well, all that. So that makes a good introduction. That's the short answer I can give. Often when people come to talk to me about the influence of Masonry on the revolution or things like that, or in the evolution of the modern world, it's true that I can come up with a rather facile answer and say, for example, in revolutions is not essential, is not decisive, but the reality is a little more subtle, because in fact the problem is knowing what you're talking about when you talk about Freemasonry, and there are many myths about Freemasonry and its historical role that need to be denounced, not as a structure. The structure we call Freemasonry didn't play a decisive role, but insofar as Freemasonry as it exists, with its identity, its codes, and the ideas it defends, must be distinguished from the historionomic object. Freemasonry, necessary history and contingent history, and so you have necessary Freemasonry, I'd like to say, and that's what we're going to talk about, which is the necessary product of a society that has reached a certain level of evolution, etc., and which is going to secrete these new forms, and which will secrete these secret societies in the same way as the body secretes certain hormones when puberty comes. Let's say you can't point the finger and say it's the hormone's fault that I've become a man when I'm not. I became a man when I was a little boy, if you've got Peter Pan syndrome, but then you'll think all I had to do was suppress those hormones and I wouldn't have grown up and so on. It's true that there are puberty blockers now that we're doing this, but let's try to keep it abstract and not stretch the metaphor too far. The idea is above all to see that it's not a foreign body that's suddenly grafted onto a society and is going to influence it in a certain way. It's not some kind of parasite. It's a secretion of society itself at a certain stage of evolution, which in turn has effects, as is often the case with historical mechanisms. Secondly, the fact that Afro-Masonry has certain orientations, and for example, I know that there are a lot of people, Catholics for example, who detest Afro-Masonry and think that it's in some kind of war against the church, so there's the whole thing about the idea that it's a kind of war against the church. The whole idea that it's Satanist, etc., it's Luciferian, and which therefore attributes to this kind of struggle a whole host of social evolutions, whereas in reality the two go hand in hand, and eventually we can consider that Afro-Masonry acts as a kind of dormone, or enzyme if you like, which is secreted by society to make it evolve in a certain direction. But it's not something that appears out of nowhere, and it's in this sense that it's necessary and decisive. That's what I'm going to try and explain to you, to help you understand that there's a subtlety to the historical role of women in Masonry. It's not a question of denying what year is one. On the other hand, it's about discussing the fact of knowing that she herself is the product of her time, is the product of a society, and that, if you like, some of its components are important and others are not, that what's important and what's decisive is what can be history, i.e. that we find in other experiences, in other times, in other periods, in other places, and that anything that appears to be a little contingent is not so decisive. So what parallel can we draw here? I was talking about the history of the century to come, and that's very interesting because it's really a parallel we've got to work out. A parallel we have with a phenomenon such as women's masonry, which has affected the whole of Western history since it first developed in England, then arrived in France, throughout Europe and in the United States. So it's a widespread phenomenon in Western civilization, and the fact is that we find and particularly in European civilization, the fact is that we find an equivalent in the history of Greek antiquity to these secret societies, the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans were likewise a kind of mystical scientific sect, and in both cases we're dealing with the same thing. So a few brief historical reminders. The Pythagorean school was founded in the 6th century BC by Pythagoras of Samos, the author of the famous Pythagorean theorem. We know how it worked, the Egyptians used it, but let's just say that in its formalization it also seems to have, in any case we don't know its origin, if it's Pythagoras, but it wouldn't be totally surprising if it were the same man who founded this school. And the doctrine of this school was naturally the search for knowledge in all fields, but with an extremely elitist idea. And so the idea is that at some point you have a society which is sufficiently evolved to produce a critical mass of people interested in intellectual things. In other words, you need to be a little advanced in the process of civilization, urbanization, and so on. And so you're going to have people who care about knowledge, but at the same time are still evolving in societies where knowledge has not the most admired thing in the world. There are still reports of very religious traditional societies, and so these are still societies that are stricken by many prohibitions. So logically enough, these individuals who are numerous enough to form a community will find mechanisms to get together and discuss the subjects that are important to them without the risk of being prevented from speaking by the stupidity of the crowd and so on. That's the idea behind these kinds of societies. And so in order to preserve themselves from the threat of the outside world, they are necessarily, in other words, people learn little by little, and as they come to be trusted, they move up the hierarchy. In fact, the aim of this organization is not to have some sort of conspiratorial role, but above all to ensure the security of its members, to make sure that the space for discussion and transmission is a bit of a circle of trust, if you like. At the same time, in ancient Greece, logically, when you have a structure like that, it doesn't invent everything from scratch. It doesn't invent everything from scratch. It will pick up its operating rules by imitation from societies that already function like that, the Hermetic societies. And in the case of Pythagoreanism, it's Orphism, which was an initiatory religion in ancient Greece, which came from the hero Orpheus and was very much focused on the individual and personal choice. And here we also find a preoccupation, which is emerging in societies on the road to civilization, i.e. that the individual, increasingly the importance of the individual in the midst of the collective. So when a number of individuals like this grant themselves this importance, they want to get together in a society, in a safe space in fact, which they organize through this system. And naturally, when you model your club on an existing structure, it's not uncommon that the structure you draw inspiration from also has a cultural influence on you in its ways of thinking, its cultures and so on. By imitation, when you find out about them, you can tend to pick up inputs from them. So that's what it did. So right from the start, you can see that the Pythagorean sect is a system that's a little mystical scientific, i.e. there's both the aspect where we meet to advance knowledge freely in these free-thinking societies, but at the same time, we're in a kind of philosophical and spiritual superior, we'd say, with the emphasis on being more intelligent than others and therefore having access to higher truths. The Pythagoreans took this as their starting point, and I remind you that this was in the 6th century BC. The Pythagoreans sought to apply the same thing to the products of Freemasonry, or at least to those things linked to the development of Freemasonry, namely thought and thought light, The idea was to apply reason to all subjects, whether spiritual or scientific. So if you already know a little about the origins of Freemasonry, you should see some important parallels. How Freemasonry came into being is still a matter of debate, but we know with some certainty that while it is not necessarily the heir to the medieval from the guilds of medieval masons, that the Freemasons, and in particular the builders of cathedrals, i.e. people who had professional secrets and kept them thanks to their secrets and their club-like nature, and with all that, the journeymen, the masters, the whole hierarchy of the guilds. What's certain is that Freemasons themselves lay claim to this lineage, saying that it came from there, what we used to call operative Freemasonry, i.e. People who tinkered with things, proposing speculative Freemasonry, which concerned those who discerned higher truths. But what's certain is that there's a clear link, at least on the side Freemasons. And what we also know is that the first currents, equivalent currents of Pythagoreans, i.e. scientists who wanted to do the same thing, i.e. to discuss amongst themselves while avoiding things that could be prejudicial to them in their relationship with the church and so on. Well, these people got together and naturally tried to model themselves a little on the way guilds existed, managing secrecy, etc., because they could see how it worked. And so you had members of the Royal Society from the 17th century, like the English Academy of Sciences. The English Academy of Sciences, who naturally fell into these trade organizations and began to imitate all that. By analogy, they were trying to build a kind of spiritual and intellectual cathedral for society. So as with the Pythagoreanism I just mentioned, that the origins of Pythagoreanism are also mystical, spiritual, scientific. In the course of the 18th century, Freemasonry developed most of its operating methods and rules, notably its rites, with initiation, hierarchy, and fundamental principles, notably the idea that reason must be applied to everything. As you can see, the parallel in the way these societies function and emerge is quite striking. In both cases, whether it's the Pythagoreans or the Freemasons, just as there is this desire to apply reason to everything, there is also the desire to apply reason to politics. At a time when cities are being created, nations appear, and so the idea that all this must be ordered politically was spreading. These societies naturally have both a head start and a particular interest in seeing how to work in these sectors, what to do and what to develop. Pythagoreans first. Pythagoreans esteemed, and that's clear, I'd like to say it's a reflection of the fact that every society tends to project outwards. I'd like to say that it's a reflection of the fact that every society has a tendency to project outwards what it profoundly is, i.e. the idea that these operating rules should apply everywhere. The idea is that power is like knowledge and must therefore be entrusted mainly to an elite and not to everyone, that not everyone has access to it. And so it seems that Pythagoras' idea was that the right regime was naturally an aristocracy, preferably a learned aristocracy. It's important to remember that at the time Pythagoras of Samos was speaking, most Greek cities were ruled by the old landed aristocracy. And the fact is that when Freemasonry was born, we were also in the last ages of the aristocracy of the Western nobility. Nobility, which obviously found in this idea of intellectual aristocracy a way of renewing its own legitimacy at a time when, generally speaking, the evolution towards absolute monarchy and the rise of the bourgeoisie as a class tended to delegitimize it. So basically, Pythagorean political thought was in fact modeled on Pythagorean conceptions of geometry, i.e. that everything had to be based on harmony and perfectly regulated in society. What's interesting about the Pythagoreans is that they not only they reflected on this in all the cities to which they belonged, but some of their branches have took an active part in political life. This was particularly the case in Magna Graecia in southern Italy. I told you about Magna Graecia when I talked about Latin America. In Magna Graecia, which was the main place where they settled, the Pythagoreans were the most active, perhaps more so than in Greece itself. And one place in particular where they succeeded in taking power at one point was Crotone in the 5th century, where they succeeded in taking power and running the city, and it didn't go so well as the people ended up massacring them. Nevertheless, there are places where they acted and places where they managed to have an influence. And what's pretty clear, and here we'll have to stop for 2 minutes, is that we think they had an influence on Clisthenes in particular. Clisthenes, was the man who definitively established democracy in Athens in 510 BC after the end of the tyranny of Epikistratides, i.e. the descendants of Epikistrades, who had taken power just after Solon's reforms. And Clisthenes' reforms were clearly rationalizing reforms. Instead of maintaining in place the old tribal and territorial divisions of the city of Athens, Clisthenes decided to implement the edem system, which would also divide up the tratis, i.e. a rational division that ignored any tradition of population or to standardize everything within the city, and all this went hand in hand with the establishment of isonomy, i.e. equal citizenship for all. So why is this interesting? Because as we shall see for Freemasonry, the influence of Freemasonry's ideas grew hand in hand with the Enlightenment, which is why many people in the Catholic tradition accuse the Freemasons of having been at the origin of the Enlightenment, which then destroyed the influence of the Church. Freemasonry also carried its ideas of rationality, and I recall Robespierre, the goddess of reason, all those ideas during the Revolution, which were put forward by people who, moreover, put an end create French citizenship, abolish privileges, abolish the social order of an ancien regime, and tried to form this people, this republic, one and indivisible, to divide it up into departments, that is to say, into geographical circumscriptions, which would have nothing to do with history, nothing to do with the people, but to purely rational considerations. And by also introducing censal suffrage, which came with it, and thus replacing the traditional distinctions of society, i.e. the society of order, by measurable criteria, notably money. So why is this interesting? Well, because you see, of course, that this political fits in perfectly with what the Pythagoreans and Freemasons were trying to achieve in their day. So it's easy to think that they were the ones who influenced this idea and that it triumphed. But in reality, if you make a little intellectual effort, you'll see once again that ideas are in things, as I often say, from the moment when the nation state appears, which is the framework of the national revolution movement by the time we reach that stage. And of course, the importance of the idea of nation triumphs above all, with the idea of associating it with the idea that there is only one set of citizens who are all equal before the law and therefore have the same dignity. And this means that you have a mass which by definition must be distinguished in a new way. And these distinctions are sought in reason because reason alone respects equal dignity. Because if you keep the traditional heritage, the heritage of orders and so on, these are precisely the things that appear to be anti-rational, since they don't depend on objective criteria, but are simply there, if you like, being the product of history. So what we're really seeing is that there's more of a convergence or community of thought between the initial preoccupation of these secret societies, which from the outset push towards rationalization, because in reality they are composed exclusively of people who belong to the most educated part of the population, and naturally the most educated part of the population is also the most rational. Rationality is explicable and therefore admissible, unlike things that are inherited from history and which appear to be fundamentally unjust, such as the privileges of the nobility and so on. So reality is, when Clisthenes made his reforms, on the one hand, we can probably say that he was influenced by the Pythagoreans, but on the other hand, we can also say that Clisthenes and the Pythagoreans are the product of the same state of society that call for the same solutions to satisfy the greatest number. So it's very difficult to speak of an influence of one on the other. We can certainly say that the work of the Pythagoreans enabled these ideas to spread more rapidly, but if you like, it's exactly the same problem as if you were asking yourself the question of the influence of Protestantism on the birth of capitalism. As you know, Max Weber's idea in the ethics of capitalism was that Protestantism ultimately favored capitalism. And then we learned from people like Ferdinand Brodel, who explained that yes, but it's strange because capitalism had already appeared a century or two before in the Italian Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, etc., which were Catholic and not at all Protestant. So what was the problem? The reality is that when you look at the way city-states became properly capitalist, you see that they generated their own Protestantism in a way, be it the Hussites in Prague or Savonarola, who was also a form of Protestant in Florence. And so the reality is that for Protestantism, people who were already capitalists or enterprising, who are people who are less inclined to social submission, who are more inclined to lead, who are more inclined to research, to innovate, all these people very naturally, they are the ones who have finally generated a vision of their own religion that would not put them under the thumb of the clergy because they didn't want to obey the clergy. And so Protestantism is in fact the formation of Christianity by and for people who didn't want to stay in Catholicism because it weighed down on them a whole host of social and political constraints they simply didn't want. So it's not that Protestantism helped generate a kind of thing, it's that the countries that were the most advanced on the road to these things tended to Protestantism, and above all, when it was in sufficiently large areas and sufficiently removed from the influence of the church, it was able to develop. If you take northern Italy, it was surrounded by Catholic powers that quickly put things right. In northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Germania, there wasn't this capacity for external pressure, and so it was able to develop strongly. And so, if you like, we're dealing with the same kind of idea, i.e. The truth is that you have a substratum, which is roughly speaking the state of evolution of society, with characters within it who have a certain number of interests and who will self-generate for themselves the ideas that suit their way of life. And so, for this political evolution, Freemasonry and the Pythagoreans both had the same role, i.e. to parallel the evolution of society, and often acted as a kind of thermometer, since they were always a little ahead of the game, since they were representative of the most intellectual part of society, and therefore of the ideas that this part would naturally develop as soon as it was detached from the constraints of the society around it. So a little additional parallel, which is interesting and reinforces the parallelism, is the fact that in most countries of the world, Freemasonry didn't play a role after that. In other words, Freemasonry evolved into two currents. On the one hand, there were those who favored the Enlightenment, but also reason above all else, and a militant desire to secularize society. This led to the emergence of two currents. Freemasonry, or regular Freemasonry, which is more traditionalist, maintains the obligation for its members to believe in God and rejects political debate. Conversely, there's the liberal obedience, which is progressive and rejects the principles of the other, saying that you have to be very involved politically and in political and religious debates. And so the regular, is the one that has remained preponderant throughout the world. In fact, it's the one that has remained the most important. In France, on the other hand, and this is a French specificity, it's the second one that became the most powerful very quickly during the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th. The second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, particularly, as you know, under the Third Republic, the Grand Orient de France represents this obedience, which in the year of the Lord abandoned the obligation for its members to acknowledge the existence of God. And so this was the real dissension with so-called regular Freemasonry, which continues to believe that its members must be at least deists. And so one thing that's very interesting is that in France we had this type of Freemasonry which was very active, particularly in the political arena, since it said that, roughly speaking, Freemasonry held the country together during the Third Republic. And what's very interesting is that it was at the forefront of all the anti-clerical battles with the separation of church and state and so on. So it's in France that Freemasonry has probably had the most assertive and notorious political role, much more so than in any other country. And precisely because of this, in reaction, a virulent Masonic virulence, and thus at the time of the Vichy regime in France you had the anti-Masonic hunt, which in my opinion corresponds to what happened to the Pythagoreans of Crotona. In other words, where the Freemasons played an extremely important political role, this led to a political reaction on the part of the population. It's an interesting parallel within a parallel. And beyond that, Freemasonry had another role to play, as did the Pythagoreans, by being circles of thought, of free thought, where intellectuals could go and talk freely about their discoveries or their intellectual research. And so it also had a role to play in the birth of science And it's in this way that Freemasonry, which was very favorable or very interested in alchemy, fitted in very well with its narrative. And then in the alchemical quest, if you like, it became a whole element of the Masonic idea. You see, alchemy is the quest for the philosopher's stone, which is supposed to transform lead into gold. And so in the quest for speculative Freemasonry and the idea of initiation, the idea was that in the end, every human being is made of lead and must work throughout his life to transform himself into gold. And so in the end, the philosopher's stone would be the secret and the Masonic approach par excellence. But then, on a strictly practical level, it also encouraged a lot of people like that, a lot of these members, to take an interest in this kind of work. But on a strictly practical level, it also encouraged a lot of people like that, a lot of these members, to take an interest in these questions. And so as time went by, societies also became more secular, thanks to the encouragement of the sciences, whether it was Greek society or European society at the time. And this brings me to the final stage in the evolution of these secret societies. As they evolve little by little, they end up become obsolete, because by dint of working like this on societies, especially as they were just a little ahead of the evolution of societies, that societies were catching up with them, well, the societies that saw their birth, that secreted them, end up in such a state that everything that made the secret necessary, the secrecy, the initiation, the setting up of these initial conditions, as we were saying earlier, has disappeared. Because when you end up in completely secularized societies, societies where reason is very important, where science has become a great value for society, the club naturally loses some of its raison d'etre, since people can talk openly about any subject they like, that it's even more effective than talking about it in a hermetically sealed system, as it allows ideas to travel more quickly. And yet conversely, as these institutions tend to age a little, they begin to develop their own interests, which may be contradictory to that of their precept. And in particular, as they are forms of brotherhood, this creates what I was saying earlier, problems of mutual aid, which can be on much more low-level issues. I need help to do such and such a thing. I'd like to get such and such a thing from the state. Allow me to build something like this. And so as you're part of the club, ultimately the club more and more, its interest becomes that. It becomes more scientific research, more all that. Because quite simply, people who are looking for that, who are looking for the scientific spirit, are no longer pushed to come and join you. And so I think there's a drop in intellectual quality, Freemasonry, very important over the last century because of that, because people who want to do science, they don't go into Freemasonry anymore. They go and join the CNRS, know my brother. It's this kind of idea. It's no longer necessary to evolve in this kind of thing. It's necessary to evolve if you want to be in a network of influence, which is not at all the same thing, and which is totally removed from the initial function of the thing. And so, at the same time, these institutions have a tendency to try and develop a new ideology, which always puts them at the forefront of the social body. And this is indeed what we've seen, because in fact Freemasonry, like the Pythagoreans in their day, in their evolution, continues to be ahead of society in their ideological evolution, i.e. they're a little ahead of the game. So what we found, for example, is that Stoicism, which is the cosmopolitan ideology of late antiquity, the city of the wise man is the world, so you have to be a citizen of the world, etc. Well, Stoicism is Pythagoreanism. We know that a certain number of the great Stoics were originally Pythagoreans, or at least Pythagoreans, i.e. they were inspired by Pythagorean thought, and therefore, naturally, if you're both a Pythagorean, with all that implies in terms of political ideas, organization according to reason, etc., and a Stoic, i.e. you believe that the city of the wise man is the world, you'll think that orderly, rational political organization should also be applied on a global scale, and so you'll become advocates of the establishment of a world state and that sort of thing. Quite naturally, in the modern West, Freemasonry has also followed the same pattern, since there was already a slight resurgence of the Stoic idea that all men are citizens of the world, and this was expressed a great deal in lodges. Already at the root of the refusal of religious debate, there was this idea of fraternity over and above divisions and nationalities, since there were also international lodge exchanges. And today we can say that Freemasonry, especially in its liberal aspect, has accepted what we call the mundialist idea, i.e. the idea that we need to go beyond nations and give mankind a single government to promote all forms of exchange erase differences and thus eliminate sources of conflict and create a rationalized world government. So once again, it's a bit like the birth of nations and their rationalization, but we can see that it's a little ahead of the game, but not so much in terms of the general atmosphere, so to speak, and that in any case it's less a driving force than a companion. At the very least, we tend to ensure that some of the most educated members of networked societies who tend to reflect on these issues naturally come to these conclusions before any other part of society. Is of Freemasonry, I'm inclined to say that it's essentially this. So we shouldn't think of it as a kind of conspiracy organization. We shouldn't think of it as an institution that would have changed the face of the world, that would have changed the world. That wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Freemasonry, because if it hadn't been for Freemasonry, it wouldn't have happened. If there hadn't been Freemasonry as we know it, there would have been something very similar, since as we've seen, most of the fundamental characteristics of Freemasonry that I've described to you were already fundamental characteristics of the Pythagoreans. And so if Freemasonry as we know it hadn't existed, there would have been another organization that would have grown out of things themselves and out of society as it was, because, as I said, there were a certain number of needs to which these types of structures came to respond. And, well, if it hadn't been as it was, there would have been something else, but something else that would have been very similar, because in all the fundamental characteristics it would have been the same thing. So it's not an absolute answer. In fact, the question of what was the historical role of Freemasonry, there you have the elements of an answer. It depends on what exactly you mean by the question. I think I've clearly described the historical role of Freemasonry as we know it, and as some may condemn it. It's very limited in relation to the adjustment that it was able to bring about, in relation to the adjustment it makes, in relation to what had to be anyway, because of the much more fundamental evolution of the whole of civilization in the end. Europe, that's all I could say in this short presentation.